In the evening, First Lieutenant Jordan ordered the Hungarians to launch another attack to see if the enemy had returned to the nearby valley. This was a risky adventure in the dark, with barely any ammunition, but the engineers managed to pull it off yet again without any casualties. Only a single platoon under 3rd Lieutenant Rule approached the valley, using the same route, firing a single warning shot, to which the Soviet troops responded with a hail of bullets. This was enough to determine that at least two different companies had returned to take their former positions, only 150 meters from the village. Just an hour later, as they were typing the report on the attack for Battalion HQ, 3rd Lieutenant Rule asked his orderly to grab his winter coat from the bed. However, it got stuck in something, and when the orderly tried to pull it harder, he got shot in the stomach. It turned out that the 3rd Lieutenant's SMG was just under the coat, and when the orderly pulled it, the coat got stuck in the trigger and pulled that as well, firing the weapon. The orderly was rushed to Battalion HQ, where he was operated on and then transported back with a medical column. He survived the war and still lived with his family in the 1980s. The night was very quiet after that incident, perhaps too quiet, although the guards had to be rotated every 30 minutes to avoid frostbite. At 1 a.m., the officers decided to look around to see if anything weird was going on outside. As they were leaving their room, Lance Corporal Korom, their liaison to the German unit, showed up, catching his breath. He explained that his roommates encouraged him to go to sleep first, and they would take turns. However, when he woke up, the Germans were gone, and nobody was manning the lines either. It seemed the entire German unit vanished into the night without saying a word to their allies. The Hungarian engineers were thus abandoned, completely exposed to the enemy, supposedly in reserve. This is how determined 1st Lieutenant Jordan was to defend the area. The engineers packed up and moved out quietly from the village back to Korocha, which they reached by 3 a.m. They heard gunfire and saw explosions to the west, which meant that the city was being encircled. This is why the Germans slipped away to avoid the trap. On the morning of the 7th of February, 1st Lieutenant Bártfai Szabó could barely stay awake, but he had to report to Major Pastor, the original battalion commander, who had returned from his leave, to see what the next move would be. The situation was not good. Soviet elements had cut the road to the west, and the road to the south would be next. Most German combat troops had been withdrawn, only a few platoons were still fighting the Soviet vanguard. There was only one remaining option: to break out with the 3 Hungarian engineer companies that were available, so the supply trains and other units could also evacuate the city. The 107th would lead this breakout, supported by the few remaining tanks, at 7 a.m. They finally received some ammunition, the bridge to the east was blown up, and the company gathered for the risky move, leaving the eastern side of the city completely undefended, which, luckily, the Soviet contingent at Bektievka did not realize. The local population remained calm. They did not attack the evacuating Hungarian troops, as a testament to the previously peaceful relationship. 4 German and 2 Hungarian tanks, along with a Nimrod armored vehicle, moved to the front, followed by the infantry, a mixed group of various units. Some German troops were already exchanging fire with the advancing Soviets on the western side, preventing them from reaching the center. Several machine gun nests had to be destroyed. This cost some time and a few wounded, as the Soviet soldiers were masters of disguise and hid their positions very well. Luckily, the tanks assisted and destroyed a windmill, along with a few other buildings that posed the greatest threat to the infantry. Once open terrain was reached, the engineers continued moving westwards, while the Hungarian tanks turned back to assist the other units. The company had 7 wounded and 10 missing, but all the sleighs made it out, along with the truck and the Opel Olympia personal car, thanks to its crafty driver. The next destination was Anovka, then Belgorod, but this would also not be so easy as they had hoped. Before reaching Anovka, German military police directed them to another route which was 15 kilometers longer. They had strict orders to keep the main road open for motorized units that were retreating from the north. Even though the company could only get 3 to 4 hours of sleep in the preceding 2 days, they had no choice but to have a short break and then continue marching. Some other units tried to cut through the fields, but this was very dangerous due to the deep snow and the cold. The men could barely walk, sitting down for a minute could mean death, as they no longer had the strength to stand up again. Luckily, at least no Soviet airplanes showed up to strafe the exhausted infantry. By 9 p.m., they finally reached Anovka and rejoined the sleighs and the only truck that were always sent ahead to the next village in order to have warm food by the time they arrived. The plan was to continue the next morning, but they received news from a German unit that Belgorod was now also contested by Soviet troops. At 1 a.m., they moved out again to reach the city by the morning hours and, hopefully, avoid encirclement. After another 7 hours, they reached Belgorod that was being attacked from the north but was still held by Axis troops. After a quick breakfast, the company was to continue, but this time around, the men were reluctant to leave the warm homes. It looked like a critical moment had arrived, so First Lieutenant Bártfai Szabó reacted immediately. He threatened the soldiers with harsh measures, and once they all gathered outside, they ran together for about 100 meters, then slowed down to look for Battalion HQ and seek new instructions. It looked like the soldiers finally understood that they had to move to save their own lives and that they could not give up hope now. Due to sporadic gunfire, they had 4 wounded when crossing a railway bridge. There, a German officer instructed them to join another unit and push back the advancing Soviets, but the moment he left, the engineers instead continued to look for their battalion. They did not trust the German ally, who had repeatedly mistreated them and used Hungarian units to cover their own retreat. Major Pastor finally gave them good news. 23rd Light Division, with all remaining Hungarian units, would be withdrawn and leave the front. They now had to march another 130 kilometers to the southwest by the 11th of February. They would leave at 6 p.m. after a short break, so at least they could eat, rest, and maybe sleep a bit. The first lieutenant managed to sleep 20 minutes, after which it was even more difficult to get up and move. At the indicated time, they could join the column, but they spent a slow and dangerous 90 minutes in the dark, surrounded by explosions and clashes with advancing Soviet elements. After some delays, they were out in the open, but it was a cold and windy night, which felt even colder in their exhausted state. The destination was the village of Bogoduhov, 130 kilometers away, bypassing Kharkov, which was also being threatened. The march was more difficult than ever before. The cold was unbearable. Those who could no longer walk could sit on the sleighs, but not more than 15 to 20 minutes to avoid being frozen to death. Each soldier grabbed the belt of the one in front of them and walked, or to be more precise, stumbled on, with their eyes closed in the dark and cold night. After 8 hours of marching, they finally reached a tiny village. The plan was to rest there, but German soldiers threatened them with their weapons, shouting angrily that there was no room for more, even though several houses had only a handful of Germans in them. The first lieutenant eventually relented, but promised the Germans that they would not forget their behavior. The engineers had to move on, but their hatred towards their arrogant, selfish, and abusive ally grew, giving them new strength. In the next episode, we'll see how another ally treated them at the next location.